See.
Yeah, you could use that, or
Okay.
how alcohol can cause fetal alcohol syndrome,
Right.
just to show you can't do whatever you want. I like using thalidomide and Accutane because these particular side effects are so gruesome
Right.
Right.
that it uncontroversially shows, okay, maybe you can't do whatever you want with your body, essentially.
Right.
Another thought experiment I ask people to think of is, let's say the sovereign zone is true. I call this one deadly transfer. Let's say you take an unborn child from the womb, 24 weeks old, put them in an incubator. Most people agree you can't kill that kid when they're in an incubator.
Right.
But what if we had the technology to take a kid from an incubator and put him into the womb? Now can we kill him?
No.
Well, if it's a woman's sovereign zone, it's her body. She can do whatever she wants.
So now she has the right.
And that shows just how absurd the argument is. The executive director of Justice for All, David Lee, made this observation, that essentially the birth canal has become the new Mason-Dixon line. That prior to Reconstruction, the Mason-Dixon line was the line that divided free and slave states. I believe it was at the border of Pennsylvania. So if a slave made it past that line, he was free.
Right.
If not, he's still a slave. So when a child makes it through the birth canal, they're free. If not, they have just the same rights as a slave, essentially.
Right.
But that shows I'm skeptical of sovereign zone arguments, and here's why. They're eerily similar to ones used in the past. For example, 50 years ago in our country, this was a common argument in the South. Well, look, if I own this restaurant, I can choose to serve whoever I want to. And if I don't want to serve some people, African Americans,
Right.
then I'm not going to.
Right.
But we realize that just because you own a place doesn't mean you can just tyrannically treat people there however you want to.
Right.
And that's the problem with the sovereign zone argument, that it's just so controversial. It rests on a premise most people eventually see, oh, just because you own something or something's yours doesn't mean you can do anything you want.
And that's the argument that you'll hear most often on campuses, on pro-choice blogs. And that's a lot of times when you hear pro-life philosophers respond to bodily rights arguments, they respond to that one,
Right.
but then they don't really look at the much stronger ones.
Right, and that actually happened to me. At the University of Northern Colorado in Greeley, I was watching a pro-life advocate and a pro-choice advocate dialogue in front of our exhibit. And then the pro-life advocate kept using the SLED criteria. How can you say it's not a person if it's dependent or in
Right.
someone's womb? The pro-choice advocate said, I'm not saying that. I'm just saying abortion's okay. And I stepped in and said, is this your argument that it's not about whether it's a person, it's that you can do whatever you want with your body? She said, that's my argument. But then I gave this woman who I'll call Carrie the thalidomide and Accutane example. So I
Right.
said, well, but what about causing birth defects? Do you think you have the right to do that in this sovereign zone? She said, oh, no, I'm not for that. She said, okay, maybe you can't do anything you want with your body. So that shows the sovereign zone is false. But
Okay.
then she said this to me. She said, but Trent, what if you were hooked up to a stranger and they needed your body to live? Should you be forced to stay plugged into them? Then I kind of turned to Carrie and I said, do you mean plugged into a famous unconscious violin player? And she kind of smiled a bit and
only
said,
the nerds
yes.
are gonna get
Right.
that.
Or if you did Philosophy 101 or Intro to Ethics in college,
Yeah.
you might remember.
That's where I was.
Okay, and what violinist are you referring to, Trent?
Well, I'm referring to an illustration from an essay published in 1971 called The Defense of Abortion. It was written by a woman named Judith Jarvis Thompson. She was a philosopher at MIT, and she wanted to approach the pro-life position and say, you know what, let's say the unborn, or let's say a fetus is a person from the moment of conception. Does that prove that abortion is wrong? Maybe not. And so she poses this illustration as kind of a counterexample.
Okay.
And this is what I want you all to imagine. So the idea is, well, if the unborn's a person and persons have a right to life, abortion must be wrong.
Right.
Unless. This is the example that Thompson gives.
Okay.
She says, imagine you're kidnapped by the Society of Music Lovers. You wake up in a hospital bed and notice a tube is coming out of your side into a famous unconscious violinist in the bed next to you. The director of the hospital runs in and says, we're so sorry that this happened to you. But the Society of Music Lovers found out you're the only one with the right blood type to keep this violinist alive. So you have to stay plugged into him because he's a person and persons have a right to life. It's only 9 months, though, and then you're free to go. But you can't unplug from him because that will kill him.
Right.
So you're here, plugged into him, 9 months. The idea, though, is Thompson says you would probably find this situation outrageous. And if you do, that means that plausible-sounding pro-life argument I shared a moment ago must have a serious problem with it. So the idea is just because you kill someone doesn't mean it's wrong.
Right.
So the idea there is that Thompson, and she's not technically making an argument here. She's just giving a counterexample. Right. I owe this observation to Michael Watkins of Auburn University in his journal article, Rereading Thompson. She's saying the pro-life position doesn't necessarily hold. Because look at this example. You can unplug from the violinist. So the idea becomes then if you can unplug from that violin player and let him die, so to speak, or not let him use your body if you don't want him to, does a pregnant woman have the right to unplug from her unborn child in the same way? Or should she be forced to stay plugged in for 9 months?
Right.
Now, pro-life advocates attack this argument in numerous ways. Right. Some people say, well, you can't unplug from the violinist. But most people think you probably should. Or at the very least...
That's exactly what I was going to ask you about, because this happened to me when I did violinist argument one time. Someone said, well, you can't unplug. It's wrong to unplug. So what do you say to that person?
Well, I would ask them, okay, maybe you can't unplug, but let's say you weren't plugged into him, and you walk in and they say, oh, we just found out that you have the right bone marrow that this violinist needs. And if you don't give your bone marrow, he'll die. And since all people have a right to life, if you don't give the bone marrow, you'll kill him. Should you be forced to go through bone marrow extraction, which is extremely painful. Right. So
and
most
this person
people
probably would have said no, but they would have said, but it's different, disconnecting yourself and killing that person. Thou shalt not kill. And so
that is the second point, that other pro-life arguers will say, well, okay, it's you can unplug from the violinist, but you cannot unplug or abort your unborn child because there's a disanalogy. As Greg Kokel from Stand to Reason would say, the parallels between the cases are not parallel. So you can act one way in one case, i.e. the violinist, and unplug, but with pregnancy, because pregnancy is so different, you have a moral obligation to act in a different way. And so that's essentially how people have responded to Thompson's argument since then. And just the debate goes on as to whether the differences are morally relevant and how they affect her argument. And several philosophers have attempted to strengthen her argument as well. And I think though it's important to look at those strengthenings of Thompson's original argument.
And we'll wait until next episode to talk about the which differences are morally relevant and which ones are not. I want to go back though, because I feel like I don't have my answer yet. The person, what he was saying was, okay, I'll say the analogy is perfect, but I'll say it's wrong to disconnect from it's a moral wrong to disconnect yourself from the violinist, where most people would say you have the right to do that. He's actually arguing, no, you don't have the right to disconnect from that person. So how would you make the argument for someone who's maybe not quite seeing it? How would you argue that, no, you should have the right to disconnect in the violinist analogy?
Now, granted, of course, this is going to rely on people's moral intuitions.
Right.
Some people are just going to have an intuition, well, you can't unplug from him. Right. You have a duty to save them. But I would say that our moral intuition that we have a right to not give our bodies to other people for their use just because they need them is pretty high. In McFall v. Schempp, a 1978 district case in Pennsylvania, the court ruled that what happened was this guy was suing his cousin, asking his cousin to donate a kidney for him. And the court said no. Court said that you could never force someone to donate a kidney or bone marrow, even to save someone else's life, that there would just be drastic consequences. They use language like, we can't let one member of our society essentially plunge their teeth into the necks of another member to draw whatever sustenance they need. So it was a colorful illustration.
The zombie analogy.
I believe that would be more vampiric.
You could definitely see that, though.
Fair enough.
But we understand that while it would be the goal of the Good Samaritan argument is to say, well, while it'd be very kind to stay plugged in, you shouldn't be forced to by law to the violinist. And if someone's intuition says they should stay plugged in, I don't see how it's that much different from saying you have to give bone marrow or you have to give one of your kidneys.
Right.
So I would say that's a high bar to reach that I don't find very compelling.
Let me ask you a few questions before you close. Why do you think that these arguments are more common now? And we're hearing the violinist type arguments on campuses more now than I felt like we were even 5 years ago, not to mention 10, 15 years ago. Why do you think that is?
I think part of the reason we're hearing it a lot more is that, well, one, pro-lifers they're doing a really good job. Sometimes we beat up on ourselves too much, but we're actually doing a good job of showing people the humanity of the unborn, using science, using ultrasounds, using philosophy to show that the unborn are persons just like you and I, and we shouldn't discriminate against them. A lot of pro-choice advocates like Frances Kissling or Kate Michelman, who was the former director of NARAL, say, pro-lifers, they've gotten savvy. It's not just, they're killing babies. They use language like, we want an inclusive human community and we want to end discrimination. They know that we're making a good scientific and philosophical case for the humanity of the unborn.
Right.
So pro-choice advocates, they're retreating, but they're retreating into a powerful stronghold of essentially saying, okay, fine, we'll grant that. But just because the unborn is human, I'm going to turn the argument around on you. So just as you wouldn't let a born person use your body without your consent, you shouldn't let an unborn person do that either if you don't want them to. And so that's where we have to come around with it. And the other thing that makes it strong, and this is an observation that David Boonin has noticed in his book, A Defense of Abortion, bodily rights arguments like The Violinist help resolve inconsistent views for pro-choice advocates.
Right. I was going to wait until next episode before we talk about how violinist reasoning fixes some of those inconsistent views. But I wanted to ask you, do you think that it's possible that one reason that we're hearing this more on campuses is because it's being taught on campuses more now?
No doubt. No doubt in my mind. Most college campuses you go to, when abortion is discussed in a class, people will read maybe 3 essays on that. And one of those essays is always going to be Judith Jarvis Thompson's Defense of Abortion, because it helps throw people for a loop. They're like, oh, wow, I never thought about it like this way before.
Right. I had to read it in my philosophy of ethics class.
So if you're a pro-life advocate who is talking to people about this, and you're talking with just your friend over coffee, you've got a neighbor, you've got a coworker, or someone that you're slowly having conversations about this, you'll probably be less likely to hear this argument from that person than you would if you were joining Justice for All on a college campus.
You may.
And having dialogues with students who have probably just gone through, oh, wait, what about the violinist?
Sure, but it's also possible they believe in right to refuse, what I call a right to refuse argument, implicitly. That they haven't thought about it a lot, but they think the unborn, for example, here's a common thing. I'm personally opposed to abortion, but I think it should still be legal. Why are you opposed? Well, it kills babies. Well, that sounds crazy. I'm going to personally oppose killing babies, but I think you should still have the right to do that. But they may be thinking, like in the violinist example, someone may say, I'm personally opposed to unplugging from the violinist. I would actually stay plugged in, like your friend who said that. But I wouldn't force other people to have to do that. Or I'm personally opposed to I'm personally opposed to not giving my kidney to my son if he needs it. But I wouldn't force any of you to make that sacrifice. So the goal of the right to refuse argument from the pro-life end is to show pregnancy is not a Good Samaritan relationship. It's a real obligation that we have as human beings to one another. And that's what I'm really looking forward to discussing with you on the next show.
Okay, so that's what we're going to cover the next show. So now that I feel like we've got at least the tools to understand this argument, which is really the ultimate pro-choice argument.
Indeed.
And it's kind of scary.
And it's tough. It is much more theologically sound. I'm sorry, not theologically, philosophically sound than a lot of the arguments we hear. I think it's important that we get it. There's going to be links on the website for if you want to read further on this. We're going to have links so you can get more into it. But what we'll do next week is actually talk about how do you refute the much stronger version of that argument.
Sounds good.
You've been watching Life Report, pro-life talk, real world answers. Life Report is produced by Right to Life of Central California. Visit their website at fresnoprolife.org.